You'll get your Spider-Man license when you fix this I feel like actor Tobey Maguire got a bit of a raw deal. Whether from an acting standpoint or from a writing standpoint, Maguire seems to get a bad rep for his and Sam Raimi's portrayal of Peter Parker, aka Spider-Man, to the point where his character has become a meme, and an unfunny meme at that. Whether it's because of a retcon, a busted-ass what-if, or because of a bad movie, I think it goes without saying that Spider-Man has fallen on hard times lately. Now, once upon a time, Spider-Man the movie was a cultural phenomenon. Prior to Spider-Man Homecoming, there was something provocative about a live-action Spider-Man movie. I have a very strange relationship with this movie and this movie series. I saw it just before I started high school. It was the first live-action Spider-Man film. It spawned 2 sequels and a reboot. And I know I'm going to make a lot of people upset by saying this, but from my point of view, it might not have been as deep as director Sam Raimi thinks it is. I also want to get this out of the way right now. I have nothing against Tobey Maguire. I don't know the man. For what it's worth, I don't think it's Maguire's fault that the Sam Raimi Spider-Man has the reputation that it does. Having said that, I think this version of Spider-Man is very bad at his job, though not Spider-Man Homecoming bad. And it comes down to a few factors, not the least of which being incompatible morals, profound lack of priorities, and way too much emphasis on comedy. Generally speaking, apart from aesthetic and action spectacle, the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy has a problem with feeling like a Spider-Man story. And what I mean by that is that they are effectively Spider-Man movies, but they're not Spider-Man stories, i.e. stories about Peter Parker being Spider-Man, so much as Sam Raimi believes that they're Spider-Man stories. The trilogy does a piss-poor job in organically conveying that Spider-Man matters. By day, it's a love letter to New York, and by night, it's a bullshit love story. And there's a fundamental flaw inherent to the Raimi trilogy with Peter Parker and the power and responsibility moral. Namely that the movies are inconsistent about whether or not it really matters to Peter. Having Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker say that he made a promise to his late uncle to use his newfound spider-like powers to help people out of a sense of responsibility, only for him to go back and forth on it in subsequent films, either because he wants to be normal or because he's high on an alien symbiote, is a consistently frustrating exercise in futility that borders on passive aggression, and it further raises the question as to whether or not Peter actually cares about responsibility. Generally, I think that this version of Peter Parker is very terrible at his job, and I'll do my best to explain why I think that is. In today's video, I'm going to attempt to answer the question of what does Peter Parker stand for, and then I'm going to talk about whether or not I think he's consistent about it. Now, I know some people watching this video are fans of the Raimi trilogy, and I'm going to try to keep that in mind going through this video. If you still like this trilogy, that's fine. I'm not here to tell you what you should or shouldn't like. I'm just here to express my opinion. And one last thing before I go any further, it's a little ridiculous that I feel the need to point it out because it says so in the damn disclaimer, but this video contains language that's not suitable for anyone under the age of 18. So if you've clicked on this video and by some freak of nature you happen to be younger than the age of 18, would you do me a huge favor and click on something else? Or at least wait a couple of years before coming back to this video? What I'm about to say in this video isn't exactly meant for the faint of heart. Okay? You've been warned. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to the very first episode of Into the RAIMI-VERSE. Now before I tear this trilogy a new one, and tear I shall, I want to start by listing a few positives. Because as fundamentally flawed as I think this trilogy is, there are a few silver linings for me, few and far between though they may be. Number 1, the costume. I used to like everything about the design aesthetic of the Sam Raimi Spider-Man costume, and for the most part, I still do. For being the first live-action Spider-Man costume in 2002, it still looks good on Tobey Maguire, when it's actually in camera. But when the costume is in CGI, not so much. The costume itself looks brilliant. I'm not entirely sure where Peter got the money for that costume, but it's a clever design. If only the character wearing that costume was more compelling. More on that later. Number 2, Danny Elfman's score. Again, loved it in 2002, but nowadays it's just okay. I mean, I say it's okay. It still sounds good on its own, but when associated with Spider-Man, for me, it can be a chore to listen to. Again, most of the problems I have with Danny Elfman's score in this movie, specifically with the responsibility theme, is its contextualization within the narrative. What little there is. Number 3, most of the visual effects in this trilogy are fun to watch. Most of them. The visual effects when the Venom symbiote climbs onto Peter Parker's hand and fuses itself to his costume isn't noticeably bad, and the same thing goes for the visual effects regarding Dr. Ock's mechanical arms. Otto Octavius is a massive numbskull before and after he gets mechanical arms, but for the most part, they look real in every frame. Number 4, decent performances. I'll talk more about Willem Dafoe in the next chapter, but most of the cast gives decent performances. Most of them. Now, as I said, most of these silver linings are few and far between, and again, sometimes what these elements are associated with is part of the problem for me. Now, expect to hear me use the term in theory a lot, because there are certain elements about this trilogy that might work on paper but don't necessarily track in execution. One of the many things that I think makes this trilogy hard to sit through is its tone and its inconsistencies. First of all, I realize that this movie takes place in a heightened world, albeit one that doesn't seem to have any mutants running around, but there's a lot of questions you might expect people to ask in the first movie that the movie never gives anyone enough time to ask. Everybody seems to either love or hate Spider-Man in the first movie, but nobody seems to be remotely curious about where the hell Spider-Man even came from. In the montage we get, some people like him and some don't. But here's the problem. That's a montage, not what the actual movie is saying. And we're told in Spider-Man 2 by Peter that J. Jonah Jameson turned the whole city against him. But you wouldn't really know that based on the movie's attitude. The general public seems to either be amazed by or indifferent towards Spider-Man. They don't seem to hate him that much or seem to be remotely afraid of what he can do. The only people who seem to have a real problem with Spider-Man have selfish to idiotic reasons for wanting Spider-Man gone. Harry Osborn, because he stupidly assumes Spider-Man murdered his presumably abusive bastard father and thinks he's a murderer, and Jameson because Spider-Man's a masked vigilante, both of whom overlook the fact that Spider-Man is enhanced. And the closest thing Jonah gets to commenting on the nature of Spider-Man is when he's first introduced and he calls him a weirdo, when he compares the possibility of getting a picture of Spider-Man to that of getting a picture of Julia Roberts in her underwear. He doesn't use the term underwear, but if I pick apart every single bass-ackwards line of dialogue in the Raimi trilogy, we'll be here all day. I don't want to talk about Julia Roberts, so let's move on. And in Spider-Man 2, when Spider-Man steals back his suit, Jonah calls him a wall-crawling arachnid, which suggests that he's slightly aware that Spider-Man is enhanced. Jonah is so preoccupied with the fact that Spider-Man is wearing a mask and the fact that he's taking the law into his own hands that he never bothers to ask why Spider-Man seems to be more powerful than the average strongman. That motherfucker could get chosen by a lantern ring tomorrow, save the planet from aliens using psionic blasts, or wake up the next morning with 4 extra arms, Jedi powers, or the ability to teleport from location to location, Nightcrawler and or Vibe style. And the only reason Jameson would care is because Spider-Man is a vigilante wearing a mask. Never mind where he came from, and especially never mind that he seems to be the only thing standing between the supervillain of the week and the rest of New York. Meanwhile, when Otto Octavius winds up with 4 extra arms, because Otto Octavius is a massive numbskull, Jonah absolutely notices, to the point where he tries to come up with a nickname for him. As far as I can tell, the reason Jameson hates Spider-Man in the comics is because he was once threatened to drop a story by a man wearing a mask. Jonah refused, and his wife got caught in the crossfire. Hence why Jameson has vowed to expose criminals who wear masks and think they're above the law. Although, I have no idea if J.K. Simmons' counterpart, live-action comic book counterpart, not the TV series counterpart, went through any of that. Particularly since this version of Jameson seems to be married in the sequels, and since this trilogy is 1/3 a live-action cartoon, we can't really be sure. And the honest answer is that the Raimi trilogy doesn't care about any of that. So I have no idea if this Jameson has the same backstory, and at the very least, Jonah, I'm sorry, but I think you've got a hell of a lot more to worry about with Spider-Man than just the fact that he's wearing a mask, or the fact that he's a vigilante. How does Jameson know that Spider-Man isn't a visitor from Mars? This bleeds right into a problem that I have with Harry Osborn, which subsequently might be a problem with the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies trilogy-wide. Characters will sometimes say things, make decisions, or jump to conclusions and/or leaps in logic about certain things and certain people based on information they don't have, while simultaneously ignoring and/or sidestepping the information they do have. The biggest example of this, I'm sorry to say, is Peter Parker's uncle, Ben Parker. If you see my review of Spider-Man Homecoming, aka Iron Man 4, you'll notice that I used Amazing Spider-Man's take on Uncle Ben instead of this one in describing the character of Ben Parker, and why I think it's a little weird that Ben's name never comes up in conversation. And you might be thinking, why that Ben Parker? Or to be more accurate, why is the Ben Parker from that movie a more quintessential adaptation of Uncle Ben in your mind over the one we're introduced to in the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie, especially when he's closer to the comics? Well, because Martin Sheen's Ben Parker is a lot more useful to Peter's development as a man and as a hero in The Amazing Spider-Man than this version of Ben Parker is to Peter throughout this movie and the trilogy as a whole, if he's useful at all. On repeat viewings, I find myself questioning Ben Parker's ideology and his reasons for lecturing Peter about responsibility in a way I don't think Sam Raimi or Avi Arad intended for me to. And in a way that I probably wouldn't have if I understood where he was coming from, and I'm fuzzy on what exactly he's getting at most of the time, specifically during his conversation with Peter. First of all, the movie does a very piss-poor job at communicating how much time is supposed to have gone by between Peter getting into a fight with Flash Thompson at school and his and Ben's trip to the library. While we're on the subject, you may also notice that the story moves at such a breakneck pace it can be difficult to tell how much time is supposed to have passed from scene to scene. And second of all, both parts of this conversation piss me off. Because at the end of the day, while he may have good intentions, I don't think Ben Parker has a clear enough understanding of what Peter's problem is. And looking back on it, it's not as mean-spirited as the nothing argument between Peter and Tony in Spider-Man Homecoming about whether or not Peter Parker has any business being an Avenger, but it's one of the most condescending, cynical-ass father-son conversations I've ever had to think about. I mean, it's hard for me not to feel cynical listening to their conversation, but the conversation itself feels like it's being cynical. And after thinking about it for several years and having seen the movie more than twice, still having the movies fresh in my mind, I think I finally figured out what my problem is with Ben Parker's speech. Namely, that he's not really saying anything with that speech. Ben doesn't speak to Peter like he's a real person, because he's not a real person, at least not to me. He's just a mouthpiece for a moral that's not compatible with this Peter Parker. But before I can get into that, I'd like to discuss a revelation I have about Ben Parker's death, and it comes down to the fact that Ben Parker really has no business being out here. And what I mean by that is, Ben shouldn't have died the way he did, if at all, because Ben Parker shouldn't have been there with Peter when he was going to the library. Ben Parker here is as much to blame for his own death as Peter Parker is, and this movie series never acknowledges this. Peter is to blame for not realizing two wrongs don't make a right, and Ben Parker is to blame because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the biggest kick to the head is that Ben didn't even need to be in that situation, and the only reason he wound up in that situation is because the script needed to get him out of the way so that Peter could feel guilty. Would this Peter Parker be as screwed up as he is had Ben allowed him to take the train? That's a very important question, one that this trilogy never bothers to ask or answer. Hours before his death, Ben has a conversation with Peter you would have expected them to have had by now, and however much time may have passed between the day Peter got bitten by a genetically modified super spider and their trip to the library. When going down a list of things that are out of character for Peter, whether subconsciously or otherwise, Ben levels an accusation towards his nephew that, had it been true, would have completely defeated the purpose of Peter being Spider-Man to begin with. Ben Parker straight up accuses Peter of starting a fight at school. To refresh your memory, Peter Parker accidentally spills some food on the back of Flash Thompson's t-shirt. Flash Thompson got pissed off about it and tried to attack him. And because Peter doesn't want to fight, he defends himself. And we all know how that ended. Never mind that he had spider powers. Ben seems too preoccupied with the fact that Peter got into a fight at school to care about how he came out of it on top. Because as far as Ben can tell, Peter has never gotten himself into a situation like this before now. And if he had all the information we have by the end of this trilogy, he'd probably be using a completely different strategy than just giving Peter a responsibility lecture.